Good evening, everyone in Alberta, Canada, and beyond. It is Wednesday, April 10th, 2024, and I'm Kerry Lambert, and I welcome you to an online webinar, Evening of Solutions for New Alberta, brought to you by the Alberta Prosperity Project, also known as APP. APP's purpose is to educate, inspire, and unite all Albertans, businesses, and organizations to protect their prosperity, individual freedoms, rights, and self-determination by empowering the Alberta government to restructure Alberta's relationship within or without Canada. And if you can, please share this webinar. I'm so excited about this one in particular. It's kind of near and dear to my heart. It's about energy. We're going to be talking to our guest, Brian Gitt, in just a minute. And if you can, please tell us where you're from, which city you're in, which town you're from, as well as what platform you're on. We're on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Rumble, as well as after this live. We're also on other video and audio sites like Apple, Spotify, BitChute, and Vimeo. Of course, we couldn't do this without your help, your sponsorship, your just being here and watching. I just want to show you that you can go on to the albertaprosperityproject.com and looking for all my, there you go, albertaprosperityproject.com. You can find out more about us. I'm actually pretty excited. We're in the process of revamping our website, and we got a sneak preview of it the other day. And I really like it because it's structured and the search works. So you can even search just for me, or you can search for the webinars, or you can search for a particular topic. So say last week we did a webinar in regards to pension, and how the Canada Pension Plan and the Alberta Pension Plan, how the Alberta Pension Plan could actually be of a real big benefit to Albertans, as well as the tour that's going on. All you'd have to do is just punch in pension plan in the new website, and you'll be able to find all that. So I'm really excited about doing that launch. Hopefully we'll be doing that in the next couple of weeks, but I know there were some little bugs that they needed to figure out, and that's typical of any new website launch that we're doing. As well, if you like what we're doing, please consider a membership, APP membership. So 1 year for $20, 2 years for $30, or 3 years for $40. Or you can also make a donation at the albertaprosperityproject.com. And of course, we always say, due to the new Canadian censorship laws, and I'm unable to show news links in online social content because of the new CRT regulations. Please share if you can, wherever you are, on Twitter, on Facebook, you name it. Do that as well. And I'm going to just remove that for a second and get back to my banners. As you can tell, I'm on my own again tonight. We are looking for other people that to help me out. So if you've got some web savvy and you're able to do some production or post-production video work, please let us know. You can also get a hold of us at the albertaprosperityproject.com website. So this is a live webinar, and we encourage you to ask questions and make comments throughout the presentation. You can put 3 question marks before your questions. That way it helps me to find them a little bit easier. Tonight's episode is called In the Dark, Fixing Energy Policies That Hurt People and the Planet, with Brian Gitt, who's a startup founder, consulting firm CEO. He's a nonprofit executive director, and he's an author. And he just came out with a book, and that's exactly the title of this webinar, In the Dark, Fixing Energy Policies That Hurt People and the Planet. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that. And he's got a great presentation to show everybody, so stick around for that as well. And with that, I'm going to bring Brian on. Hello, Brian. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited for our conversation.
Thank you so much. It's as we were saying earlier, that it's been an interesting couple of weeks trying to run the show by myself. And you and I have exchanged a few emails, and pleasant to talk with, and definitely well versed on the topic of energy. And
by the way, I love the intro video to this whole session, all about prosperity. And that's, energy is the foundation of civilization. It's the foundation of prosperity. So
that's right.
I'm excited to dig into the details related to how we can really make progress and prosperity going forward with more energy.
Exactly. And that's what I love. I and having read your book and taking a look at the charts that are in there, like, we are definitely on the same path, but you started on a completely different path. So maybe, Brian, just give us a little bit of your self-history and what kind of got you into the path that you're on now?
Yeah, I mean, I can just thinking back, I can picture the lecture hall I was sitting in when I was about 20 years old, and I was in northern Arizona. I was listening to this energy expert. His name was Amory Lovins, and he's famous for writing a number of books, and he's consulted with Fortune 500 companies, et cetera. And he stood up there and said, more sun hits the Earth's surface in 1 hour than the whole planet consumes in a year. And that really blew my mind. At the time, I was all in on renewable energy, on solar, wind, and energy efficiency. And that really charted the next 20 years of my career. I worked in California running a lot of the energy efficiency programs for utilities. We worked on all kinds of different commercialization projects of new energy and clean technologies. And so I was in the belly of the beast in California. So I saw it firsthand. And unfortunately, these programs just didn't live up to their promises. They didn't scale. And there was a bunch of events that happened that really showed me that we can talk about later. But yeah, I come from an environmental lens. I came into this because I fell in love with the wilderness and the outdoors. And I used to lead adventure trips in Alaska for teenagers and stuff. And so I came from an environmental side and got really interested in energy and the built environment, because that's the biggest impact. And what I found over the couple decades of working in that space is that I was on the wrong path. I was not backing the right technologies. And so it took a long time and a lot of introspection to figure that out, unfortunately. But now I work actually in the nuclear power industry, and I'm a big advocate for fossil fuels and oil and gas, and try to ultimately, we need to use more energy all around. Right. So that's my personal mission.
That's awesome. And just for our viewers as well, Brian is actually in California. So he is in the belly of the energy beast, so to say, in the US, and dealing with all the government regulations that are going on there, as well as you guys probably have quite a bit of immigration, as well as people moving in and out of the state, don't you?
California has no shortages of problems and challenges, that's for sure. Yeah, there could be a whole series of podcasts about all the topics.
Yeah, that's right. But we'll just try and stick to energy and what's going on, well, specifically in the U.S. And I'm not going to kind of get ahead of ourselves with the presentation, but for the most part, you're looking at stuff as solutions, or at least things that are going on in the States. And as we were talking before the show, we also have other issues up here in Canada, and we'll try and wrap that up after the presentation, just to kind of compare the two, and I think that would be a really good dialogue. So with that, do you want to just jump right into this, Brian?
That sounds great. Yeah, okay. Let me share my screen. I have some visuals that we can be looking at here as we go through it. All right. Are you able to see my screen now?
I will put that up right now. There you are. Yeah.
All right. Excellent. Well, to kick things off, I think today what's happening is there is a false story about energy that is influencing policymakers, investors, and corporate leaders. And it's really concerning, because this story is threatening all of our quality of lives. It's this is nothing new, right? We know false stories have really shaped culture and influences society many times in the past. I mean, a few examples of this. I mean, imagine you were a doctor in the 1950s when people didn't think smoking was bad for you. Or imagine in the 1990s, you remember the fat-free craze and SnackWells and all of the various, I mean, just about every product you wanted to get, ice cream, yogurt, anything was all fat-free. People thought that those were healthy. And then, or imagine you're an economist in 2008, when right before the housing crisis in the US at least, and at that point, people thought that home prices would always go up, and nearly anyone with a pulse could get a zero-down mortgage. So we've seen this before, how powerful false stories shape culture, shape policy and investment decisions overall. And today, we're seeing a false story about energy. And the story goes something like this. Fossil fuels are destroying the planet, and wind, solar, and electric vehicles are the only thing that can save it. Right. That's the story that we're hearing, and it's being echoed through whether it's legislatures around the world and world leaders, or you're hearing it in big corporations, even big financial institutions like BlackRock and others, all the way down to the local level. And many people, though, especially those that work in the energy industry, and I know in Alberta, there's a pretty significant percentage of people that work in the oil and gas sector and are very close to these issues and very knowledgeable about what's actually happening on the ground. Many people know that these stories are not true, right? We know that these policies actually aren't helping people and are not protecting the environment, but they've become so widespread and so pervasive in our culture that many people feel powerless of how to fight back, how to stop this, because it's kind of like a runaway freight train that's barreling down the tracks. And unfortunately, it is really threatening our quality of life overall. And let me give you an example of this. So this is my friend Adam, and he's the CEO of Innovex. Now, Innovex is a services company that helps oil and gas companies pull oil and gas out of the ground. And in 2020, he's based in Houston. In 2020, he wanted to get his employees, he had, I think, 400 or 500 employees at the time. He wanted to get them a jacket for Christmas, and he wanted to get them a North Face jacket with the Innovex logo on the jacket. You know, you've seen these all the time. And North Face refused. They refused to put the Innovex logo on the North Face jacket. Now, this was pretty shocking to Adam, and you know, it's the ultimate of hypocrisy, because when you look at all of North Face products, when you look at almost every single product they make, whether you're talking about jackets or tents or sleeping bags or backpacks, I mean, you name it, they're all made of all materials that come from fossil fuels, whether you're talking about nylon, polyester, various adhesives or synthetic dyes. All of these things come from fossil fuels, but it's more than that. I mean, everything that goes into making the materials and the products, but then you got to ship all of those products and materials all around the world, which requires a lot of diesel fuel or people driving to the stores to buy these things in terms of using gasoline. But it's even deeper than that, because no one would have the time or money to actually be able to go out and enjoy skiing or backpacking or all these outdoor sports without oil and gas actually giving us the prosperity to basically have the free time and money to do these things. So it's the height of hypocrisy. And what's interesting about this story is Adam was like, you know, this is too much. Like, this is so offensive. So what he got together with some of his friends in the oil and gas industry, and they developed this ad, this billboard ad.
Perfect.
And they placed the billboard ad right on the way to North Face headquarters.
Yeah.
So that all of the people that work at North Face and people that drive right by North Face would see this. And all they were trying to do is highlight the fact that, look, you guys make great products, but come on, all your products are made from fossil fuels. So you're welcome, right?
Yeah. And for those people that may be watching on Spotify or listening to on Spotify, the billboard says that North Face puffer looks great on you, and it was made from fossil fuels. Your friends in oil and gas.
Yeah.
Thank you, NorthFace.com.
Yeah, and you know, this is not to vilify North Face. You know, here's an image of me standing on a glacier in Alaska about 25 years ago in a North Face jacket. And what's interesting, this jacket has kept me warm and dry in the most extreme temperatures and places on Earth. And I love North Face, man. They make great quality. I still have this jacket today. I still wear it every winter. This is 25 years old. And so I'm not here to vilify any particular company, but it's important to highlight the disconnect between a company that has embraced this false story about fossil fuels that actually enables them to exist and for their products to be made and sold. And as I was alluding to earlier, I come at this from an environmental lens. You know, what I was doing in Alaska in this picture, I used to lead outdoor adventure trips for teenagers. We would go for 40 days in Alaska, and we'd do mountaineering and ice climbing and sea kayaking and all of these various things, because I love the outdoors and I wanted to share those experiences and educate teenagers and kids about this to gain an appreciation for it. But what has happened is this vilification of fossil fuels is insane, because our entire society, there's nothing else in human history that has helped the prosperity and the health and the overall well-being of people more than fossil fuels. In addition to helping people, they actually also have helped protect the environment. I mean, this is one of the biggest kind of falsehoods and aspects of this, because at the end of the day, we still have 3.7 billion people living in energy poverty across the globe. 3.7 billion, that's 40% of all humans on Earth don't have enough energy today. And when you're going to cut off access to fossil fuels, it actually forces many of those people to engage in behaviors that are even worse for the environment. So consuming less fossil fuels ultimately equals more pollution. Now, that sounds a little bit strange to most people. It sounds a little counterintuitive, but it's not. And we're going to unpack that here with a little bit more detail, because ultimately consuming less energy results in more pollution. And this is shown, we've seen this pattern over and over and over again. And this is why energy poor nations pollute more. So let me just give you a few quick examples of this and why. So let's just take the Ganges River in India. Now, this is the most polluted river in the entire world. It has untreated sewage and industrial waste that is 3,000 times more than the safe limit, right? It's disgusting. I mean, it's just full of sewage in waste byproducts from factories just dumping stuff in the river. Now, this is an example of more pollution. No one wants that. I mean, obviously we want to have clean rivers, but when you don't have the energy infrastructure to have a sewage treatment plant, and because you don't have the economic development that enables that, that's what you're going to get, is lots of pollution. Let's look at another example of less energy equals more deforestation. So here's an image of the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And these are both developing countries. They both are relatively poor. However, on the Haiti side, they use wood for cooking and for heating. And so they chop down all of the trees because they need that wood to heat their homes and to cook their food. Well, right across the border, you have the Dominican Republic. They use 8 times more energy per capita compared to their neighbors in Haiti. And almost all of that is from fossil fuels. And what you see in this image is that the Dominican Republic has this nice forested landscape. And right across the border, you have Haiti, what it looks like everything was clear cut and chopped down. And that is the result of more energy use protects forests, because you don't need to chop down all the wood for heating and cooking. Another example of this, where more energy equals less pollution, I mean, we've seen this pattern many times. Let's take in the 1950s, the Thames River in the United Kingdom. It was declared biologically dead because of severe pollution. It was, I mean, it's like in the US, we could set some rivers on fire in the 70s, right? We had a lot of pollution challenges. But today, the Thames River, it's thriving, and it has all kinds of diverse species of fish and birds and other wildlife. Well, how did this happen? How did it transform between, in a few short decades, from being biologically dead to having all this wildlife? Well, they built water treatment systems and incorporated pollution controls, and all of those things take energy. They take infrastructure. But if you don't have the energy and infrastructure, you will get more pollution. Now, air pollution is also a huge problem. Worldwide, it kills 4 million people every single year or die because of air pollution. It's a huge environmental problem, right? But air pollution is fixable. And we've seen this many times across the developing world and developed world. So let's take London again, going back to that example. Well, London in the 1700s, as they started ramping up coal plants and moving into the 1800s, they started to get a lot more pollution. And then especially this hit a high point in kind of the early 1900s, early 20th century.
Mhm.
But after they were able to build up enough wealth in economic development, they could afford various pollution controls and better technology and cleaner burning fuels. And ultimately, their air quality got way better over time. And they have some of the cleanest air anywhere right now.
Mhm.
And this pattern continues to repeat itself. As you economically develop an area, you can afford this kind of infrastructure to control pollution and protect nature. The last example, or actually two more examples I'll give on this, is Singapore. So Singapore, many people will know as one of the cleanest cities in the world. When people talk, it's like you can't even see gum on the sidewalk in Singapore. But Singapore in the 1960s was a dump. And here's this image on this slide shows like overflowing trash cans. And it was a relatively poor nation at the time. They had garbage everywhere. They had factories that were just leaching chemicals into the rivers and into the waterways. However, through economic development and new cleanliness laws and new waste management systems, which all take tremendous amount of energy, they cleaned it all up. And now it is an absolute immaculate, clean city, and is really considered one of the cleanest cities in the world. Right. So the last example I'll give on this in terms of more energy equals less pollution and just overall protecting of nature is land use. So wild mammals have declined 85% since humans started really populating the earth. So why this huge loss in biodiversity, right? Most of that is due to agricultural land use. Humans for many thousands of years needed a lot of land because we are so inefficient with our agricultural practices. We needed to chop down the forest, clear all the land, and basically use it for agricultural production because we were so inefficient.
Yep.
Modern agriculture, though, in wise use of fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and all the machinery that we use, has shrunk the land use per person by over 50%, while at the same time boosting the production and food supply. So with this chart, for those of you that have the visual here, agricultural land use per person has fallen off a cliff. It's dropped precipitously. So by mechanizing agriculture, by using fertilizers and herbicides, we've shrunk the amount of land we use, and we preserve more land for nature. And we basically stop that trend of mammals declining. So all of these things are just examples and stories around how more energy use and more wealth and more economic development ultimately leads to less pollution and more protection of wildlife.
Brian, if I can stop you, just one thing there. So you've given us a few great examples, and specifically, I'm going to say the Singapore thing where it was a dump and now it's clean. Here we're talking about agricultural land use, and we've now said we can actually grow more within less land. However, all of the stuff that you've talked about so far is heavily influenced by government protocols and government overreach, right? Because even I'm going to just bear with me for a second here. The idea behind Singapore, and you're from California, I know that San Francisco is kind of heading into that same sort of dirty pool with garbage and all that, and that's based really only on because of the way the government mandates or the government permits and everything that they do and everything that they touch seem to cause problems with that. So if we had less government and we were able to use our technology, our fossil fuels, I think we'd be in a much better position than we are currently.
I agree. And that's a perfect segue to what is the solution? How do we fix this? Yeah. And I think ultimately we need to tell better stories about energy and its impact on people and our environment overall. Because if we don't expose these falsehoods that many of our leaders in government, especially in the developed world, are promoting, we are going to go down the wrong path. And we have to tell the truth. And we have to give examples and tell better stories. And unfortunately, many of us, especially in the energy industry, as I said before, it was just overwhelming. This false story is so widespread and is permeated all of these institutions and government agencies. And it just feels a bit hard, our uphill push. But we have to do it. We have to learn how to tell better stories and shift the narrative. And I would really boil this down to there's 4 big falsehoods, right, that really need to be combated, and we need to course correct on. So the first one is all the examples I just really gave, right? That this falsehood that using more energy damages the environment. It's just the opposite. Using more energy protects the environment. And you see this all across the developing world. And I just gave you a bunch of examples of that. So I'm not going to unpack that anymore because I want to shift gears and talk about a few other things. So what are the other big falsehoods? The second one is fossil fuels are being phased out. Well, that is absolutely not true. And I'll unpack this in a minute and show some more data on this. But we're going to continue to need fossil fuels for transportation, agricultural industry. Even if we do cut fossil fuel use for power production, which we will over time gradually phase that out, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And regardless, we're going to need more fossil fuels in 2050 than we do today. So, and I'll unpack this a bit, but this is the second big falsehood. The third one is that solar, wind, and electric vehicles are the only thing that can save the planet. When objectively, it's not true. We know that nuclear and natural gas is a very clean burning fuel. It has 50% of the CO2 emissions is coal and only 10% of the air pollutants. And nuclear has 0 emissions in terms of its generation. So nuclear and natural gas are way better for the environment than solar and wind when you look at it from a materials basis, land use basis, and waste. And we'll talk about that in a second as well. I just want to kind of highlight the 4 big falsehoods, and then we'll kind of dive deeper into them. And then the last one, the fourth one, is that nuclear power isn't safe. This is absolutely bananas to even say that. I mean, nuclear power is the safest form of energy we have. It's just as safe as wind and solar when you look at all of the data on this. And I'll unpack that as well. So those are the 4 big falsehoods that I want to talk about a little bit more in depth, and that we have to combat this false story around. So let's. Oh, sorry. Did you have a question?
I was just saying this is great. This is exactly what our viewers want to see.
Okay.
Give them the education so that they can go out and say, "Hey, did you watch this video? Everything that we've been told is a lie."
It's really unfortunate how much misinformation is out there. So let's talk a little bit about this number 2 big falsehood, that we're not this falsehood about that we're rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels. So 82% of the world's energy today still comes from fossil fuels. And when you look at actually the trend line, fossil fuel use grew 3 times faster than wind and solar over the last 20 years. So this isn't just something that is in the past. I mean, we're talking about recent trends. And I would bet money. If anyone wants to take this bet, I will take this bet. The world will consume more fossil fuels in 2050 than today, based on projected growth in the developing world. I mean, especially in Asia. And here, if you look at this graph, this tells the whole story. When you look at from 1965 to 2021, and you look at this trend, please show me where we are rapidly transitioning from fossil fuels. You see oil, you see coal, and you see natural gas all growing. And the trend line is continuing up. Yes, you're starting to add wind, you're starting to add solar, you're starting to add biofuels and some other energy sources, but they're additive. They are not replacement. And this is a really important part of this equation. And people, if they just look at the data and they'll see it, is stark as day, right? I mean, I don't know how you could even argue with this. And the other aspect of this is that solar and wind are inherently, by the physics of those technologies, they're intermittent resources. Everyone knows that the sun doesn't shine at night and the wind doesn't always blow. But so what that means is you need a redundant grid. You need a baseload grid of typically natural gas and coal or nuclear power. And then you have these additional technologies that layer on top of that. But you can't eliminate the baseload power, because in many parts of the country, the wind can go to zero for weeks.
Yeah.
In Europe, just a couple seasons ago in the UK, there was a 6-month wind drought.
That's right.
6 months, right? There's no battery storage or any energy storage solution that can come anywhere near storing enough energy to deal with days, much less weeks, much less months of intermittent energy. And then even if you have the batteries, which, by the way, today, most batteries only are good for 4 hours. And batteries are great, by the way. I love batteries. I mean, all of us have used batteries in our lives. I think they're a great technology, but they're not going to replace natural gas power plants, right? Because today's batteries typically go for about 4 hours. And even the long duration batteries they're working on, even if they double it, even if they triple it, that's nothing. You're going to need days to weeks worth of additional storage to overcome seasonal differences. And especially where you guys are in Alberta, I mean, in the winter, it's freezing, it's dark. I mean, there's no way that you're going to run the grid on renewable energy in Alberta. I mean, that's just, I know you guys are blessed to have a lot of hydropower, which is great.
In
hydro,
Canada, for sure.
Yeah, is a great resource.
Yeah.
But not everywhere has access to hydro, and it's certainly not going to provide all the energy we need. Yeah. So this myth that we're rapidly transitioning away from fossil fuels is absolutely false. So the next one to unpack a little bit that we hear over and over and over again is that solar, wind, and batteries are better for the environment. Well, they aren't. I mean, when you really step back and think about this from first principles, and you think about environmental harm and environmental impact, you got to look at the entire life cycle of a technology. Now, I am agnostic on technology. I don't really care as long as it's delivering its intended use in a low-cost manner and it's reliable, and ultimately, ideally, it's clean as well. But solar and wind and batteries are not. I mean, they use the most materials versus compared to nuclear, natural gas, and others I'll show you in a minute. And you have to look at how many materials do you have to dig out of the ground using all the diesel equipment. You then need to process all those materials. You need to make them into products. You need to ship them around the world. Then you basically have to look at all the land that takes up. And then you got to dispose of that at end of life. When you add up all that materials intensity, all of that land use, I don't see how you could possibly justify solar and wind as being an environmentally beneficial technology. Yes, they don't emit emissions, which is great at the point of generation. But there's a lot more emissions that are embedded in the life cycle of a technology. And when you compare it to nuclear and natural gas, I think they're just inferior products. Again, so you're not going to be replacing the need for baseload power anyway. So ultimately, I believe that solar, wind, and batteries are worse for the environment than nuclear and natural gas when you stack them up. And this chart, I think, highlights this very clearly, that if materials use ultimately is the best measure of environmental harm or protection, the more materials you use, the more harm you create. And when you look at the material requirements on a per ton of materials per terawatt hour or megawatt hour, or however you want to look at it, this particular chart is in terawatt hours. You can see that solar and wind use tons of steel and silicon and plastic and lead and iron and glass and copper and concrete and all of these core materials. All of these things are very energy intensive, and they all have to be shipped around and moved. All of this requires tons of energy.
But isn't the argument that, oh, this stuff will last forever? Solar panels last forever. Wind turbines last forever. Nuclear power plants you have to replace, and natural gas you have to replace the plant.
Oh, it's just it's just the opposite. Nuclear power plants typically are lasting 60 to 80 years with refurbishment, which is many of them in, for example, Ontario are being refurbished as we speak. There's a lot of people think that they can go for a century or more, but they certainly are going 60 to 80 years, whereas solar panels, you're talking about 20, 25 years tops. That's wind, right. Becomes uneconomical. A lot of the studies that have done on wind turbines is that people claim that you can have them for 25 or 30 years, but that's not true. What you see is that they're uneconomical because of the maintenance cost to keep them running, and their output drops off a cliff after about 16 or 17 years. So they have to be basically either refurbished or redone, which even takes more money and more materials and more energy. And that you just can't afford to run them. So generally you're looking at, let's say, I would say being generous around 20 years for those technologies. And when you basically have to build, install, and dispose of a wind farm or solar plant 3 to 4 times over. Like build it and throw it away, build it and throw it away, build it and throw it away to equal one nuclear power plant. I mean, it's just, it doesn't even come close to when you think about the true life cycle of these kinds of deployments.
Totally agree. Yeah.
So beyond the materials, though, we also have the land use impact. And the reason why land use is important is because, as I was illustrating earlier with agricultural footprint, that's the biggest way that we basically consume a lot of nature and basically cut down forests or take over various grasslands is through agriculture, but also it's with energy technologies. And what this slide is showing, basically, it's ranking the various technologies from the best to worst by the amount of land required. And so the best technology in terms of the smallest footprint, the least amount of land to generate the most a lot of power, are small nuclear power plants. Then followed by large nuclear power plants, then natural gas, then solar, and then wind. And it's kind of in that ranking, in that order, based upon how many meters of land per megawatt hour is required, right? And it's just a huge amount of land because these solar and wind are very inefficient. And the fact that they're intermittent, these technologies just require lots of land and resources to make them. So then the question usually comes up, okay, well, we understand that these use a lot more materials and they might take up a lot more land, but what about CO2 emissions? Because everyone seems to be so concerned about CO2 emissions that that's the number one thing that is driving policy, right, and policymakers.
Absolutely.
Well, CO2 emissions, if you really focused on that, if that was, and I'm not saying it is the most important thing, I'm just saying if it is the most important thing from a policy perspective, then you would look at those things that have the biggest opportunity to reduce CO2 emissions. Well, in the United States, as using an example, when you look over the last 20 years, the biggest reductions in CO2 emissions by far, and it's not even close, are transitioning from coal plants to natural gas plants. So natural gas replacing coal. 61% of all of the CO2 reductions are that. Solar, 8%. So 61% natural gas plants replacing coal, 8% emissions are from solar. So if CO2 is really what you care about, why wouldn't you want to embrace technologies that have the biggest impact on that? Absolutely. And we're not even gotten to nuclear power, which has zero CO2 emissions, right? But just even using natural gas would be a very effective strategy to reduce CO2 emissions. Now, when you actually start looking at solar, this is a little nuanced because a large solar power plant emits 4 times more life cycle CO2 emissions than a nuclear power plant on average. Because when you have to make that solar panel, it is made in essence from coal and a lot of hydrocarbons and using a lot of energy and a lot of chemicals that go into making that. Now that's an average, that's a world average, 4 times more life cycle CO2. But that's not reality because most solar panels are made in China. Actually, 75%, it depends on the parts and components, but overall, about 75% of solar panels are made in China. And solar panels made in China emit 25 times more life cycle CO2 emissions than a nuclear power plant. And the reason why is because China's energy system is dominated by coal. They don't have nearly the kinds of environmental emissions requirements as we do in the West. And so therefore you're using pretty polluting energy and very energy intensive processes to make these panels and then ship them all around the world. And so if CO2 emissions was truly the aim, which I don't think it is, honestly, I think there's other objectives there. Why in the world wouldn't you embrace nuclear power and natural gas as solutions to that? Because they've proven it over and over again. I mean, certainly large hydro is great too, but unfortunately, we're not going to build a lot of large dams anymore due to the various environmental concerns about large dams and rivers. And a lot of the best spots, quite honestly, have been taken. And those projects cost so much money now, those kind of mega infrastructure projects. So when you look at our available options about reducing CO2 emissions, hydro is great if you got it, but we're probably not going to build a lot more of it. The best thing we could do is try to transition coal plants to natural gas and to build as much nuclear power as possible, right? As fast as possible. And that kind of gets me to the last big falsehood that I identified prior to going into this and unpacking this, which is this claim that nuclear energy isn't safe. Well, the data is clear. We have 70 years of commercial operating nuclear power plants around the world, and it's not an insignificant amount of energy. In the United States, for example, nuclear power, there's been about 100 plants. Right now, we have about 92 operating nuclear reactors. They provide approximately 20% of all the electricity in the United States comes from nuclear power, and it has been doing so for the last close to 70 years. And these many plants around the world, both in Canada and Europe as well, have been operational. And when you look at the track record, when you look at the history in terms of the death rate per unit of electricity production, it's just as safe as wind and solar power. There's no significant difference in the data in terms of actual harm. And there's been only 3 accidents in the entire 70 years. And 3 Mile Island didn't even hurt anyone, right? 3 Mile Island in the United States, no one was harmed, no health impacts. The amount of radiation that was released into that community was equivalent to you going to Colorado for a weekend and going on a hike in the mountains. Oh, yes. Right? Yeah. There was no significant health impact whatsoever. Now, I'm not trying to minimize an accident. Accidents are always something to be taken very seriously, right? We don't want to have any accidents, but we have to look at the actual data and the results. And the fact that 3 Mile Island didn't harm anyone, and in Fukushima in Japan, there was no one that was negatively impacted. There was one person that officially his cause of death was due to radiation exposure from Fukushima. I mean, it was a terrible tragedy, right? Anytime you have people dying, but it was basically an earthquake that creates a tsunami that came in and killed a lot of people, right? And then they stoked fear through the evacuations because of this plant that got shut down. Now, that is completely avoidable. And even the advanced nuclear plants today, they don't even need backup diesel generators that plant. The problem, what failed at Fukushima was that when the tsunami came in, they shut down the reactors just fine, but the tsunami knocked out the diesel backup generators that was circulating the water coolant to remove the heat from the fuel. So once you knocked out that basically cooling water source, you had the fuel melt down. Well, modern designs and new advanced reactors, you don't even need backup power because they self-cool and they self-regulate using natural forces like gravity and thermal expansion, et cetera. Now, all of the existing plants are safe. And even that, you could argue, it didn't have a radiation event that caused harm, except for, I guess, officially that one person. And that person also was a smoker. So there's some skepticism on the part of that one claim. But in general, nuclear is it is absolutely the safest form of 24/7 power that we have, and is evidenced by the history in this track record, right?
But we see on media and we see in movies that and nuclear is just bad. We should just not use it at all.
Yeah, I mean, it has the smallest amount of materials, the smallest land footprint. It has 0 air emissions, no CO2 emissions. It basically, you can recycle the nuclear fuel. Nuclear waste is not even a problem, right? I'll give you an example. In the United States, in 70 years of commercial operation, again, 20% of the electricity supply, there's 90,000 metric tons of uranium, spent fuel, right? That sounds like a lot. That could fit in one Walmart supercenter, right? 95% of that energy in that spent fuel is still in it. And we can recycle it and
That's
turn it into new fuel to put into new reactors and burn it up, right?
Yeah.
So it's not a I would argue it's a gift to future generations. It's not a burden, because we should be extracting that energy out of it and
Yeah.
using it to power. There's enough spent fuel just sitting there right now that in the US we're paying about $1 million a day in taxpayer money to basically just have it sit there and be monitored, et cetera. Well, if we were to recycle it, we could power the United States for over 100 years at our current level of power consumption. 100 years with this waste byproduct that's just sitting there. To me, that's insane not to leverage that, not to use it.
The Simpsons scenario with the oil drum, and it's full of this oozing goo, and they throw it in the bottom of the ocean. That is not true at all, is it?
No, it's not liquid. It's a solid. These are just either oxide or steel, depending on the fuel type. And it's just sitting there in stainless steel concrete casks. You could go and hug those casks. In 40 years, 99% of the radiation is gone, right? And then even in a few hundred years, you have to eat the stuff to cause any adverse health effects. Now, obviously, I'm not recommending eating spent fuel. I'm just giving you an example. Now, we have way more dangerous, toxic chemicals that we store and have to deal with that even last for longer than that, right? So there are a lot of things we got to be careful. We have to be thoughtful. We have to be careful. We have to put in safeguards for sure. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but we do this with all kinds of chemicals and all kinds of industries, right?
So I'm not sure where the rest of your presentation, but I will ask. I know that California has basically said through policy that they are not building any more nuclear power plants, and as a matter of fact, I think they're decommissioning some, aren't they?
Well, there's one remaining nuclear power plant in California, Diablo Canyon. It provides about just under 10% of the electricity in the state. It was slated to shut down, but because California is short on power and they were going to basically be in danger of having blackouts, every governor knows it's political suicide to basically cut off your power plants and create blackouts. So they extended it through 2030. And there's efforts underway to keep it going beyond that. There's no reason to shut it down. It would be crazy. It's generating 24/7 clean power, baseload power for the state, a state that has a lot of energy challenges. And that does get us back into kind of the final step here of the last few slides I have, which is, what is the path forward? I mean, if these are the big falsehoods, the big false stories that are being told, how do we combat that? And when we look at a better energy strategy, I mean, there's really three things we have to consider, and we have to have alignment around what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve? Well, we want to increase human progress, human well-being, make people's lives better, and we want to protect our environment, right? That's what we're aiming at. So what are the evaluation criteria we should use that weigh all the costs and benefits to get us to that goal? And I would argue there's three basic categories. You have human factors, and this is everything from security, energy security, meaning of a country, reliability, cost effectiveness of the power, safety, versatility, scalability. Then you have environmental factors. These are things like materials use, land use, pollution, waste. And then you have local feasibility factors. Like in Canada, you're blessed with a lot of hydro, which is great. You should do hydro. But in Phoenix, Arizona, you don't have hydro, right? So you have to deal with what is feasible locally.
Yeah. And the transportation of the power as well. Like you just said, Phoenix. Well, we'd be able to provide you, but we just have to create the transmission lines to get that power down.
Yeah, and unfortunately, those are very difficult to build politically because no one likes big transmission lines running through their backyard, and they usually get embroiled in decades-long lawsuits and all kinds. You have to deal with multiple agencies when you cross state lines, and all of these various environmental groups will fight tooth and nail. So it's very hard to build out transmission. So these are just a quick, in the book, I go into more detail and I give the US as an example. Like, how do you think about evaluating these technologies, and how do you rank them, and how do you weight all of these different criteria, the human criteria, environmental criteria, et cetera? And how would you think about doing that? How would you choose the best technologies in your local region, which again, are going to vary whether you're in the UK, or Ontario or Alberta or Phoenix, right? All of those things are going to be different in terms of the solution. And so, but there are some basic ideas and principles that I would say that universally we should be considering in terms of a better energy strategy and a path forward. So the first is that I think we should accelerate the transition from coal to natural gas and nuclear power. I think coal is going to be necessary in many developing countries because it's most important to give them more energy. That should be the number one priority. But as soon as possible, no one likes to breathe dirty air, and coal, unfortunately, does really pollute the air and creates a lot of health issues. So the faster we can transition people from coal to natural gas and to nuclear power, it will be a huge benefit. Now, that's not going to apply everywhere, but that will apply most places, right? Then another core idea is just we need to finance more power plants, transmission lines, and pipelines in the developing world. Right? We're doing just the opposite. The World Bank and the European Investment Bank, they're wanting to divest from fossil fuel infrastructure, from building out more power plants. That is insane. We should be doing the opposite. Again, as I started off the presentation, the more energy that can be infused into people's lives, the more you're going to protect the environment, right? So we should be doing everything we can to accelerate the amount of power plants and transmission networks of energy. Then we have to reform regulations to support the rapid deployment of nuclear power plants. Too many places. Now we have to be thoughtful. We got to be safe. Some regulation is necessary. Obviously, we want to keep our communities safe, but we've gone way, way extreme on this. And it is really having a negative adverse impact because we're not actually building enough nuclear power plants because of all this red tape and bureaucracy. So we got to reform these regulations. We need to end finance restrictions on oil, gas, and coal, right? Because we need more of it. Even though we need to transition from coal, we're still going to need more coal in many parts of the world for the foreseeable future until they can develop economically to a point that actually enables them to transition to a cleaner burning fuel like natural gas or nuclear power. But these finance restrictions are not helpful. We should build hydro and geothermal plants wherever we can. Now, as we talked about earlier, they're just not available everywhere, right? You're not going to have that resource, but where we can, we should build them. And we have to eliminate these renewable energy subsidies. They distort the price of power. They're like parasites on the economics of thermal power plants. They're basically shutting off. They're not allowing thermal power plants to run economically because they're getting this huge preference and subsidy to basically, they can sell in at a negative price into the market, push all the other power plants offline because of these subsidies. So we have to stop that. Price signals are so critical to basically valuing a resource. And we need to build more pipelines. We need to build a lot more pipelines for domestic oil and gas production and distribution. And this is a problem. I'm sure it is, I would imagine, in Canada like it is in the US. People are blocking pipelines from being built. And we need more pipelines. This is absolutely essential. We've got to be able to get the energy to the places we want it and need it. And we have to have the infrastructure to do that. We also need more liquefied natural gas facilities so that as the world is going to transition from coal, we need liquefied natural gas. We need to have these export terminals and these facilities to be able to transport this critical resource all around the world. And then finally, we need to upgrade and expand refinery capacity, right? A lot of this infrastructure is decades and decades old, and we haven't been investing in it because so-called we're transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is completely false, as we talked about. Petrochemical use is going to be significantly higher, depending on what numbers you want to look at, whether it's 12%, 15%, whatever, depending on part of the world, it's going to be higher. We're going to use a lot more petrochemicals than we do today. And we need refineries to be able to make the products that we all want and chemicals that we need to live well, right? And so this is a really key thing. We need to invest in that infrastructure. And so that's that. I'll stop there and just kind of, we can have more of a conversation. You know, if folks want to learn more about these ideas, if they want to, the best place is to find information on me. I'm on X, or formerly Twitter, just at my name, at Brian Gitt. you can get my book. I've designed this book to be a really short, like 1 or 2 hour read. You could do in a weekend or a sitting or two. It really goes into more depth on a lot of the issues and topics I was just talking through today. And yeah, if you just go to the website, you can subscribe, you get articles and just updates on what's going on.
Yeah, that's great, Brian. And I did read the book. So you have it so that you can just read it online, or you can download and buy the book. It's like $9.95 or something, right?
Yeah, it's $9 plus.
Yeah,
I think in Canada there's some extra shipping costs, but
probably.
it's really we don't make any money. Just for the record, we're not making any money on the book. I don't make a single cent on the book. We basically designed it to be short, to be easily shippable. The whole idea is to spread these ideas and get the word out, and to educate people, whether they be policymakers or investors or corporate leaders and just people in general, on this critical issue of energy and how we can help combat some of these false stories.
Yeah, I know we haven't mentioned our good friend Alex Epstein yet, although you did quote him in your book. Alex did come up here and did a presentation specifically about the policies that are happening in terms of the limiting production because of oil and natural gas, because everyone's supposed to be going green. And he argues that no, that's not at all what we should be doing. If anything, just like you've said many, many times through the presentation, is that we need more oil and natural gas production.
Yeah, no, Alex is great. I've learned a lot from him. He's really a clear thinker, and has really he's one of the few people that had the courage to stand up and to these false stories and say, no, you guys are wrong. This is critical. Right. And he embraces nuclear power and moving to clean and burning fuels as well. But we have to have fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are the foundation of modern civilization. Yeah, we cannot exist without them.
Well, and one thing, like not only does a barrel of oil create like 600 types of products that we use for everything under the map, but it's also is the hottest burning too, right? Coal and oil and gas, because we talk about, well, why don't we just move everything over to electricity, and then we won't be able to smelt steel without really adding a lot of infrastructure in order to do that. So again, the way your book describes it is there has to be a balance between a lot of different factors, environmentally, as affordability and those sorts of issues, and you name off a bunch of them. And so I definitely recommend not only share this video for our viewers, but go download that book and take a look at it and read it through the weekend and pass it on to everybody else that you know, because I really do believe that is the way to get through this, is more oil and gas. And the issue that I've got right from the get-go that I said was we're basically being crippled through policies from governments to say, no, we must go green. Everything must be green. And no matter what, we got to go green. We got to go solar and wind. And there's no ifs, ands, or buts.
And those aren't green technologies.
No,
I mean, I think that's where we need to. I think the way I view this is we have to take more responsibility for how to tell better stories, because I don't think if you actually think about this from first principles and you really look at full life cycle emissions and materials use and land use and all of these things, those are not green technologies. If you want to minimize harm to the environment, if you want to protect the environment, you should use the most concentrated energy available. And if that's your goal, then things like natural gas and nuclear power are way better for the environment on balance. Now, they're not perfect. There's no silver bullet. Everything has trade-offs, right? There's, obviously natural gas, you have emissions. Nuclear power, you still have some spent fuel, some waste you got to deal with. But on balance, we're not trying to find there's no perfect solution. You're always going to have trade-offs that you're weighing. What we're trying to do is choose the one that is optimal, that minimizes harm while maximizes prosperity and progress.
And especially when we're talking about location or country, or the example that you said with Haiti. So Haiti is burning wood, right? Is there any possibility that through some sort of government policy we'd be able to ship them coal, either on freighter, like I'm kind of making this up as I talk, but would it be more beneficial to ship them coal as opposed to them clear cutting all their wood down and in order to cook?
Well, they don't. I think the first step would just be liquefied petroleum gas or natural gas. You know, there's because right now the reason why they're cutting down their forests are basically to get wood to cook their food with or to heat their homes with. So with petroleum gas, you could. That's what Dominican Republic has embraced. That's what they're using, right? So, and that's a clean burning fuel as well. So that would be a solution. Now, all of this has to be driven by sound economics, right? I don't think it's a good idea for governments just to be subsidizing other countries. Or why would we do that anyway? Why would people in Canada want to subsidize people in Haiti? I mean, it doesn't make sense, right? You need to have self-sustaining economic models, but energy is the foundation for that. Cheap, reliable energy is the foundation for all industry. You cannot have a thriving economy without it. So that has to be thought through. And the more investment in infrastructure and energy development you have, the lower cost energy you're going to provide. And you're going to attract more factories, more industry. And then it's a positive feedback loop from there. So what we could do, I think, in the West is we could invest in some of that infrastructure, right? I mean, presumably that's what the World Bank's job is, right? Is to invest in infrastructure like that. Unfortunately, recently they've have this very anti-fossil fuel stance where they've pulled back considerably on investing in that kind of fossil fuel infrastructure, in pipelines, in power plants, and all of these critical infrastructure investments that would help lift people out of poverty, at the same time protect the environment and move them along towards cleaner burning fuels. I mean, no one wants to breathe dirty air or drink dirty water. There's a natural human incentive. We all want a cleaner environment. I've never met a person that would choose a dirtier environment or to walk around a place where all the forests are cut down. We'd like to have our recreation in nature and have access to this. And we can have it. We can do it.
Lots of questions, which is great. I'm going to get to them. I'm going to ask just a couple of quick questions as I was going through the book as well as the presentation on here. So a funny question. So right at the beginning, you talked about the North Face jacket and that you were up in Alaska and you were wearing it. You're still wearing it 25 years later, and it's still great. Did you know at the time that you bought that jacket that 95% or 99% of that jacket is made out of petroleum products?
No, I didn't even think about it at the time. I was, this is, I think, important because I was, when I was younger, I was a diehard environmentalist. I was absolutely blind to how a lot of things were made. I worked for years promoting renewable energy and efficiency professionally in my career. I worked with utilities and government agencies and all these things. I understand. Now, I wasn't a bad person. I don't think most of these people are bad people. I was ignorant for part of it. I was lacking real context, and I was willfully blind as well. I was possessed by an ideology instead of looking at things in a very balanced and open and clear-eyed manner. So no, I did not think about the North Face jacket and all of the petroleum products that went into it like I do today.
No, that's for sure. And I know even like the Al Gore video of the world burning and all that in terms of climate change, but there were no solutions brought out saying, you know what, we could probably mitigate this stuff by just adding more oil and gas. Like even in terms of saying that Florida is going to be under 20 feet of water. Well, even if it was under 20 feet or going to be under 20 feet of water, we could probably still come up with solutions using oil and gas to create something that would prevent it from being under 20 feet of water, right?
No, the best solution, we've seen that. I mean, climate-related deaths have fallen off a cliff. They've dropped over 98% as we've gotten wealthier and have more infrastructure and ability to insulate people from natural disasters and harm. We have early warning systems. We have air conditioning. We have heating. We have all of these technologies that help prevent us from succumbing to the wrath of nature.
That's
right.
right. And
I mean,
more
let's
people
be honest.
die.
Mother Nature has been trying to kill us for about hundreds of thousands of years.
That's
We've
right.
done a pretty good job of
Yeah.
getting through and through innovating using technology, and we're doing better. So if climate change is your number one concern, I think two things would be true. You would want to, number one, accelerate the path to nuclear power as fast as humanly possible. And many of the people that are adamantly opposed to nuclear feel that climate is their number one issue. And then two, you would want these kinds of investments to shelter and mitigate the risk of natural disasters. Why does it make any sense? Why would we invest in a new energy infrastructure that is more vulnerable to changes in the weather, meaning wind and solar and water,
Absolutely.
right? Because we're seeing droughts happen. Well, if droughts happen, you can't create hydroelectricity. If you have more erratic weather, you have less wind in some areas, how are you going to generate your energy?
Yeah.
If anything, if the climate is getting more erratic, then you'd want more stable, more consistent, more reliable energy.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Because even solar panels, certainly up here in Alberta, we get hailstorms, it seems like all the time in the spring. And I can just imagine the damage that would happen on a solar farm. But not only that, but even just flooding. Like there would have to be so much resources going in and setting up the solar farms, these wind farms, that to me it just, well, why didn't you just use that energy to just do a nuclear power plant instead?
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. I'm going to just go through a couple of these questions here. Our good friend Michelle says the federal government wants to shut down Alberta oil and gas. So, and that seems to be very true here in Canada. They basically have already talked to our premier and said that we're going to limit the amount of oil and gas production by 2030. And depends on what day of the week it really is, because they seem to be changing this policy all the time. Is that also happening down in the States? Do you find that your federal government, and I know states and the feds have a different way of looking at their resources, but do you find that seems to be a policy down there?
Oh, absolutely. The oil and gas industry is demonized. They're vilified.
Yeah.
They're under attack politically. And ironically, they're doing really well right now because they've showed a lot of fiscal discipline and they've been returning a lot of money to shareholders, et cetera. However, the problem is we're not really investing in the future because there's a lot of concern about stranded assets, and they're basically made the industry such a pariah undeservedly that it makes it very difficult to build new infrastructure. And this false narrative, this false story has permeated not just government, but it's permeated local institutions and various communities in such a way that they don't want to build the pipelines. They don't want to have the infrastructure. So it's very difficult to build new pipelines, upgrade refineries, much less build a new refinery or other kind of critical assets.
Yeah. Linda asks two questions, but they're kind of related. What is the life cycle of nuclear plants, and how are they assumed toxic material disposed of at the end of the life cycle? We talked a little bit about that during the presentation, but what is the efficiency of nuclear power relative to fossil fuels? That's an interesting question too. I'm assuming if we're talking about a cubic meter of a particular element, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, let me see. I think I have a good example here. Let me see if I can. Oh, here we go. So I have if you can see this in my hand here, for those of you that are listening, it's a piece of metal. This is actually tungsten, but it's meant to represent uranium metal. This is about the size of my index finger, right? So it's about a ½ inch around, about the length of my index finger. This piece of uranium metal could power your entire lifetime from the time you were born until the time you die. This chunk of metal, that's how concentrated, that's how dense, that's how powerful. It is millions of times more energy dense than even fossil fuels. And fossil fuels are very energy dense. When you look at energy return on energy invested, which is a useful metric to think of how much you got to put in versus what you get out, When you invest 1 unit in, you get 100 units out with traditional nuclear power plants. Fossil fuels, natural gas, oil is about 30. So you invest 1 unit in, you get 30 units out. And then you go all the way down to between 3.5 and 5. So for wind and solar, for every 1 unit in, you get 3.5 to 5 units out. So it gives you the scale for comparison of, but it's amazing. This little chunk of uranium metal can power your entire lifetime. I think I mean, think about it like a golf ball size of metal.
Yeah.
For those of you that aren't on video, imagine a golf ball and that lasting all the energy you need for your entire life.
That's incredible. I never thought of it in that way, and I'm not sure whether our viewers actually thought of it that way too. Something else that we've been talking about is what about small nuclear units, like the ones that I guess would be strapped onto your house or maybe even a neighborhood?
Well, we probably won't be putting them on homes, but I actually work on this. So I work in the nuclear industry, and I work for a company that we design, build, and operate small nuclear power plants. So this is something that I do spend most of my day thinking about and working with customers. So these are going to be excellent solutions for large energy customers like data centers, factories, industrial sites, oil and gas operations. Any kind of large energy. You're not going to see it you would put it in a master plan community. We're engaging with large real estate development. When you're putting in thousands of homes, then you could put these types of powerhouses in to power that whole community. You're not going to have it at the individual home level. It doesn't make sense economically to do that. But you are going to have a more distributed energy network. This also works great in northern territories for mining operations that are really remote. Then you don't have to build out all of that transmission network as much because you can have a more decentralized grid where you're powering things closest to the load. So generally what we're seeing with these smaller advanced nuclear power plants, the smaller designs, I mean, some of them are down to 1 megawatt, but most of them that are what they call micro reactor, all these definitions are silly, but you're talking about like say 10 or 20 megawatts, which would be maybe like a small factory or a small data center for, let's say, a large financial institution. Now, the large data centers today are scaling tremendously more. You're talking about hundreds of megawatts for these large hyperscale data centers. But that's really over the last few years, they've been scaling up, especially as all of these workloads for artificial intelligence and all these other applications are coming online. But yeah, small nuclear power plants, I think, are going to play a really important role in not only reducing the amount of transmission infrastructure we can build, having things close to the load, which inherently is going to be more reliable. We're working a lot with military bases. That's mission critical operations. You need 24/7 reliable power. No matter if you don't want power lines going down, you can basically have 10 years of energy just sitting there next to your load, whether you're a data center or a military base. It's just right there. So there's huge resilience and reliability benefits in addition to just the constant 24/7 power.
So would these small units be feasible to be in a neighborhood and powering all the electric vehicles that we're told that should be out on the highways by now, and yet we don't have enough infrastructure in our current grid to do? Would these small nuclear units be able to do that?
They absolutely could do that. I mean, if you're going to have a bunch of new electric vehicles on the road and you're doing it for environmental reasons, then you really should be charging them with nuclear power. I mean, that makes the most sense, right? And you could have basically areas or sections of the community where you have this kind of infrastructure that doesn't have to be massive, huge centralized infrastructure. Like the traditional nuclear power plants are 1,000 megawatts or 1 gigawatt. They're huge. Whereas these, we're talking about, you could have 10, 20, 50 megawatt units distributed around, and they don't require that kind of massive cooling towers and big infrastructure. They can be nestled in. We're working with master plan community developers, putting them in residential areas in these master plan communities. I mean, you're not going to put it right next to the homes, right? You're going to have some But it's mostly just for perception, because most of these new advanced reactor designs, they don't even have land setbacks. They don't even have buffer zones. So from a health and safety perspective, you can put them anywhere. You could put them in downtown Manhattan right now. You're not going to do that just because the real estate value in Manhattan is too high. It wouldn't make sense. And the public perception, why fight people and all the NIMBYs? But you could, from a health and safety standpoint. For example, at MIT in Boston, they have a nuclear reactor right in campus, right in Boston. All right. I mean, there's no reason from a health and safety standpoint you can't have that.
This is the stuff you don't see on mainstream media. Because, well, and why is that? Do they not want us to have these conversations about that? Is there such a lobbyist group out there saying we don't want to have nuclear? I don't know if you know that.
Well, it's complicated. There's a long history of this. It's not a simple answer to that question. I would say there's a lot of reasons why nuclear power did not flourish for a long time. One is just the economic. For example, most of North America, we weren't growing our load, right? So why would utilities invest a bunch of money in new power plants when you don't have load growth, right? So that was just one reason. Then you also had in addition, you had a very strong environmental lobby that was spreading a lot of misinformation. You had a lot of people conflating nuclear weapons with nuclear power. And when, post-Vietnam War, when all of those people that were anti-nuke, meaning anti-nuclear weapons, they basically refocused some of their energy on anti-nuclear power, which is obviously a completely different thing. And not it all the same, but there's a lot of history, and it's complicated. There's a lot of converging factors. I think at some point, obviously, understandably, the fossil fuel industry wasn't very excited about nuclear power coming in. I would say that's not true today, because I'm working with quite a few fossil fuel companies, and many of them are very pro-nuclear, and they're actually putting them in. For example, in the Permian Basin, there's a bunch of companies looking to put small nuclear power plants in to power oil and gas operations. So I don't think that the resistance today, maybe historically there was some resistance from the oil and gas industry, but I don't think that's the case today. I think today you just have some public perception challenges that from this past misinformation and this conflation between nuclear weapons and nuclear power.
Yeah. And actually, Michelle basically asks, why doesn't industry promote themselves more, meaning like nuclear or oil and gas? And I think we just kind of touched on that. It's just this preconceived notion or the history, and we really need to help a lot of these industries get a leg up and say, you know what, nuclear is good, and why are we not doing this? So put the pressure on our politicians to say, I think we should look into this. And not just quickly dismiss it. Oh, well, it's dangerous. We're not going to do this.
No, you're absolutely correct. Both the oil and gas industry and the nuclear industry have not done a good job of self-promotion and really controlling the storytelling aspects. That's what I think is the root. That's the key thing that we have to shift. We have to tell better stories, and the industry's got to stand up for themselves. Now, there are great examples of this. You have people like Chris Wright of Liberty Energy, or Toby Rice of EQT, that are obviously leaders within the oil and gas industry that are very much promoting this very positive vision and highlighting the positive contributions of oil and gas. But we need more leaders stepping up. And the nuclear industry is just as bad and guilty. They've just done a terrible job about telling the story. Both industries have really the best story you could possibly imagine. I mean, nothing has lifted more people out of poverty. Nothing more than oil and gas and fossil fuels. Nothing has contributed more to the quality of our life, to our healthcare system, to our hygiene, to all of safety, all of these things. So why aren't we telling those stories? We have to tell those stories. And I think the industries have been in this defensive mode. They've ceded territory and they've allowed it to happen. And yes, it is overpowering. It is difficult, but you have to fight back, right? You can't just sit there and whimper in the corner and expect everything to work out okay.
Yeah. There are a few questions in regards to climate change. This is a good question. So why is the world being taken over by fear-mongering through the climate crisis today? Or today they were on the news, the United Nations, that we only have 2 years to survive. And how do we stop it? lots of people getting rich, but not our taxpayers. We seem to be spending more and more money on this. Any comment on that?
Well, fear obviously is a very useful tool that sells media, sells advertising, sells clicks,
Yeah,
sells engagement. So I understand why the media taps into this very effective tool
yeah,
of engagement, because that's how they make money. It's
yeah,
like Charlie Munger's famous quote, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcome.
yeah,
Well, when a media is incentivized to drive ad revenue, they're going to tap into fear-based messaging. But I think it is an important thing. I mean, it's beyond just the media. We have politicians that have really embraced this ideology of climate alarmism, which is not based in science. I mean, it's there. If you actually read the IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it isn't a doom and gloom scenario. Now, the summary for policymakers, the political documents that get basically, but if you look at actually the foundational scientific underpinnings of those documents, they basically say that the world is getting slightly warmer. You're talking about 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. And then when they do the analysis, no one knows what the economy is going to be in 50 years or 100 years. We don't even know what it's going to be next week, hardly. But even in the IPCC report, they say that the average person will be 434% wealthier than today.
yeah,
So what are we even talking about? Yeah, it's slightly less than maybe without the climate impact, but it's still, we're better off. So
yeah,
we know how humans, we are the apex predator because we are incredibly adaptive and innovative, if nothing else.
yeah,
And we've already shown that. That's why climate-related deaths have fallen off a cliff. 98% drop over the last 100 years, right?
yeah,
So yes, the climate seems to be warming. We know how to basically combat that and to adapt to
yeah,
that. And
yeah,
ultimately, if your goal is human flourishing, if your goal is to improve human well-being, we need a lot more energy. I would say, when I've looked at this, imagine this: instead of this net zero carbon emissions by 2050 mantra that you hear nonstop from every politician, every
yeah,
corporate leader, you hear the drumbeat of net zero by 2050. What if the message was 250% more energy by 2050? What if
yeah,
that was the message? Imagine how that would drive the policy around how much good we could do to lift people out of poverty in the developing world. How
you're
much
correct.
cleaner environments could we have by all the things I talked about earlier, about building out our infrastructure, transitioning to cleaner burning fuels, embracing new technology to drive down emissions, shrink our land footprint, shrink our materials footprint by using more energy, not less. So our goal should be more energy use. Now, we should do it in a thoughtful way, responsible way, and move towards cleaner burning fuels wherever we can.
Yeah.
But this whole idea that we should consume less energy is counterproductive. We're doing more harm. We're hurting people's quality of life, and we're hurting the environment more than if we would, push on the gas and use more energy.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And we had quite a few questions in regards to like nuclear energy and oil and gas, and I think we've kind of covered a lot of those questions. But here's something that is happening here in Alberta, and I'm not sure if it's actually happening down in the States or more specifically in California. But the question is, what do you think of carbon capture policies? Do you know what all that's about?
I'm not a fan of carbon capture.
Okay.
I don't think it's a good use of time and resources and money. I
Agreed.
think there's much more. If the goal is to reduce CO2 emissions, I think there's much more effective investments in doing that. I don't, carbon capture is basically you're trying to suck carbon out of the air. Carbon is about 0.4% of the air, right? So there's different types of, when we talk about capture, there's what's called direct air capture, meaning you basically have a big fan, you're trying to suck air into it and strip carbon out of it. And then you have another type of carbon capture where you're actually trying to capture emissions coming out of a power plant or out of a factory or an industrial site, right out of the flue, right? Now, out of the two, it certainly makes more sense to capture it right at the source. It makes no sense to me, 0 cents, to do direct air capture. Like, why are we expending all this energy? It's like trying to suck salt out of the ocean through a straw, right? I mean, it just makes no sense whatsoever, direct air capture. I'm not a fan of even carbon capture from power plants and things like that. I mean, some of the oil and gas companies are embracing it, and I understand why politically they're doing it. I just don't think that is the best use of our time, money, and energy. I think if the goal, again, back, what are we trying to achieve? I think there's much more effective ways to reduce emissions and improve quality of life than carbon capture.
Yeah, no, I agree. And then I'm just going to say, kind of end this part of the conversation here. Maureen says the average person listens to state-funded media that pushes a narrative. If the average person would look at the actual scientific data, they would see a completely different picture. And that's kind of.
I would agree, but you know what? Data doesn't convince people. Stories convince people. We know this. I mean, you can't pound people with facts over the head. I mean, all advertising knows it. Nike knows this, right? When Nike wants to sell more gear, more tennis shoes, or whatever it is, they don't pound you with facts about how great this shoe is and the performance of this shoe. No, they sell you a story. They have, Serena Williams winning Wimbledon championships, or Tiger Woods being this amazing story. That's what they sell. They sell a story. They don't pound you with data. So I agree. More people being more scientifically literate and using critical thinking would be a wonderful thing for all of us. But ultimately, I think what will really change things is that we need to tell better stories, and we need to highlight all of the benefits that are obvious in all of the great stories that we have, from the energy workers in the field to just how these benefits manifest in our everyday lives. Just look around your house. I mean, everything you see, everything you touch, this microphone, this computer, this floor I'm standing on, all of it is coming from fossil fuels. I mean, so how can we vilify something that is enabling us and protecting us from the elements and improving our quality of life?
Yeah, no, that's true too. And Michelle says we have to convince our premier to stop promoting carbon capture and our tax dollars to pay for it. So
I would agree.
Again, we have the power. If we have the voices in order to make the change and to be a more prosperous province, then we should be doing it. And the same thing with you in the States. If there's any way that you could use your voice or get people there to make change in California or anywhere in the United States, for sure, then that's what we should be doing.
Agreed. I mean, that's why I'm talking to you now. That's why I wrote that book. That's why, I mean, more of us need to speak up. We need to have our voices heard. We need to tell better stories and work together collaboratively.
That's right. Yeah. Well, with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for coming on the webinar and presenting this. And again, you can just go to briangitt.com and you can download the book or buy the book. Actually, I'm going to log in and buy the book and get a copy here. Does it actually come from you?
Yeah, I work with an independent publisher, and again, I don't make any money on it at all. It just it covers the printing and shipping, basically.
Yeah, and but what I was going to say is, if you wouldn't mind autographing it for us, that'd be great. We could put it up.
Oh, I see. It doesn't actually get shipped directly from the printer, so I don't. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the ability to sign it before it gets shipped.
No, that's great. One other comment that did come up here, and I just want to show you because I think it's very valid. It's from our good friend Chris Scott, who is the former interim CEO here of the Alberta Prosperity Project. He says, "I like to host an event with speakers like this," meaning yourself, Brian, "debating our misguided politicians at a public event." Would that be something you'd consider? Have you done that?
Potentially. I mean, it's just a matter of schedules and timing and all that. But I mean, I think we do need to have more conversations like that. And I would almost frame it not as much a debate as a conversation, because I feel like when you set something up as a debate, people get defensive and they entrench in their sides and they don't really open to listening. I personally don't find debates that useful. I think having conversations is really necessary, though. And we need to have better dialogues. But I think the framing of the whole engagement is important in terms of how you set it up.
Yeah.
Well, I really want to thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to come on. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate your reading the book and sharing it with others. So thank you so much.
again, thank you. And I'm going to wrap things up. I just wanted to let people know that we do these webinars every Wednesday, and hopefully you got a little bit of information out of this, and you can pass this on. And just so you know, next week I'm actually away next Wednesday, so we're going to be doing a replay because we do these every Wednesday, and I need a little bit of a break sometimes too. So I'm actually away next week, but we're going to be doing a replay of a webinar on digital banking. And it's with Tanner Today, as well as Brett Oland, who is the CEO of the Bow Valley Credit Union here in Alberta. And really interesting discussion. We have played this before, but we're going to add a little bit more to it. So that is next Wednesday. So and with that, thanks again, Brian, for everything that you do and for all that valuable information. Amazing, and we will definitely be in touch. We're going to have you back on here again because I'm still fascinated with a lot of the other energy policies that we could possibly make good positive change going forward in our future too. So,
well, thank you, Kerry. Appreciate it. Have a good evening.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Night.